Picture this: a cold, windswept moor in northern England. A young woman stands alone, her dark dress whipping in the wind, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She's small, plain even, but there's a fire in her eyes that won't quit. This is Jane Eyre, a woman who refused to be broken by a world that wanted her silent, invisible, and obedient. And her story, written by Charlotte Bronte nearly 2 centuries ago, still crackles with defiance today. Now, let's step back for a moment. Before we walk through the creaking doors of Thornfield Hall or shiver in the shadow of the Red Room, we need to meet the woman who created this unforgettable heroine. Charlotte Bronte wasn't just a writer, she was a survivor. Born in 1816 in a remote Yorkshire village, her childhood was a landscape of loss. By the time she was 9, her mother was gone. Soon after, 2 of her older sisters died in a matter of months, victims of a brutal school that would later haunt her fiction. Imagine that for a second: 2 graves, 2 empty chairs at the table, 2 voices silenced forever. That kind of grief doesn't just fade. It carves itself into your bones. And for Charlotte, it carved its way into her stories. But here's the thing about Charlotte and her siblings: they didn't just endure their pain. They transformed it. Together, they built entire worlds on paper. Tiny, cramped handwriting filling every scrap they could find, inventing kingdoms called Angria and Gondal, complete with histories, wars, and poets. It was their escape, yes, but also their power. They weren't just dreaming, they were creating. And that habit of building worlds from nothing? That's the muscle Charlotte would later flex when she wrote Jane Eyre. Now, fast forward a few years. Charlotte's in her 20s, working as a governess, a job that's basically a masterclass in loneliness. Governesses were the original invisible women. Educated enough to teach the rich kids, but not rich enough to sit at the dinner table. Not a servant, not family, just there. Like a ghost in the hallway. Charlotte moved from house to house, always the outsider, always watching, always noting the way power played out in drawing rooms and nurseries. And every sting, every slight, every time she was talked over or looked through, she filed it away. Because one day, she'd give that experience to Jane Eyre. Now, let's talk about that opening scene. 10-year-old Jane, locked in the Red Room at Gateshead Hall. It's not just a punishment, it's a statement. The Red Room is where they send her when she dares to fight back, when she refuses to be the quiet, grateful little orphan her aunt demands. And what's in that room? Heavy curtains, dark furniture, the ghostly presence of her dead uncle. It's a cage, but it's also a crucible. Because in that room, Jane does something radical. She screams. She kicks. She declares, "I am not an angel. I am a human being." And just like that, we know this isn't a story about a girl who learns to behave. This is a story about a woman who refuses to break. From Gateshead, Jane is shipped off to Lowood School, a place that makes the Red Room look like a picnic. Lowood is cold. Not just in temperature, though it's that too, but in its soul. The girls are half-starved, the rules are brutal, and the headmaster, Mr. Brocklehurst, is the kind of man who'd call freezing children a moral lesson. But here's where Charlotte does something brilliant. She doesn't just show us cruelty. She shows us 2 ways to survive it. There's Helen Burns, the gentle, doe-eyed girl who endures every hardship with a smile, preaching forgiveness like it's the only scripture that matters. And then there's Jane, fiery, unrepentant, asking why the world is so unfair and refusing to accept because I said so as an answer. Helen's path is one of quiet acceptance. Jane's? That's the path of the sword. Not literal, of course. Jane's weapon is her mind, her words, her sheer stubborn will to be seen. And when Helen dies in Jane's arms, it's not just a tragedy. It's a turning point. Because Jane realizes something: meekness won't save her. Only her own courage will. Years pass. Jane grows up, toughens up, and lands a job as a governess at Thornfield Hall. And oh, what a place Thornfield is. Imagine a house that's equal parts castle and maze, turrets piercing the sky, corridors that twist like secrets, and a constant sense that the walls are whispering. It's beautiful, but it's also alive. Like it's breathing. And inside that house, Edward Rochester. Tall, dark, brooding, the original tortured hero before it was a trope. He's got a sharp tongue, a sharper mind, and a past he keeps locked tighter than the attic door. Now, most stories would have Jane fall instantly, helplessly in love. But this isn't most stories. Jane and Rochester, they fight. They debate. They match wits like fencers, each trying to outmaneuver the other. And here's the kicker, Rochester likes it. In a world where women are supposed to be decorative and agreeable, Jane is neither. She argues. She challenges. She looks him in the eye and tells him when he's wrong. And for the first time in his life, Rochester meets someone who sees him, not his money, not his status, but the man underneath. It's electric. It's real. And for a moment, it feels like Jane might actually get what she's always wanted, to be loved for who she is. But Thornfield has secrets. And one night, Jane hears it, a laugh that isn't human. A scrape of footsteps in the dark. A door at the end of the hall that's always locked. And when she finally finds the key, she discovers Bertha Mason. Bertha is the woman in the attic. Rochester's wife. The madwoman he's kept hidden for years. And she is not what you'd expect. She's Creole, with dark skin and wild hair, her clothes torn, her eyes burning. She's called a monster, a beast, but here's the thing, Bertha isn't just a person. She's a mirror. She's everything Victorian society feared: passion, sexuality, rebellion. She's what happens when a woman refuses to be controlled. And Rochester? He didn't just lock her away because she's mad. He locked her away because she was inconvenient. This is where the story gets messy. Because Bertha isn't just a plot twist, she's a bomb. She forces us to ask, who's really the monster here? The woman driven to violence by years of imprisonment? Or the man who put her there? And what about Jane? She spent her whole life fighting for her place in the world. But now she's in love with a man who's done the very thing she's always hated, silenced a woman, erased her, treated her like she wasn't even human. There's a woman locked in the attic of Thornfield Hall. Her name is Bertha Mason, but to most, she's just the madwoman, a shadowy figure whose laughter echoes through the halls like a ghost. But Bertha isn't a ghost. She's real. And her story is the dark heartbeat of Jane Eyre, a reminder that every grand estate has its secrets, and every fortune has its cost. Bertha was once a woman from Jamaica, married to Edward Rochester in a union that was never about love. It was about money, power, and the cold calculations of empire. The wealth that built Thornfield, the fine furniture, the sprawling lands, the very comforts Jane enjoys, didn't come from thin air. It came from sugar plantations worked by enslaved people in the Caribbean. Bertha's confinement isn't just a personal tragedy, it's the price of Rochester's privilege, a literal and figurative locking away of the violence that funded his life. She is the skeleton in the closet of British colonialism, hidden but always there, rattling the walls. And then there's Jane. She hears Bertha's cries. She sees the truth. And she's faced with a choice: turn a blind eye, marry Rochester, and live in comfortable ignorance, or walk away from the only love she's ever known. It's not just a romantic dilemma, it's a moral reckoning. When Jane says, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me, I am a free human being with an independent will," she isn't just talking to Rochester. She's talking to every force that would cage her: society, poverty, even her own desires. This is her declaration. She will not be owned, not by a man, not by a system, not by her own longing. So when the truth about Bertha comes out on what should have been Jane's wedding day, she doesn't hesitate. She leaves. No dramatic farewell, no last kiss, just a quiet, devastating exit. She walks away from Thornfield with nothing but the clothes on her back, choosing starvation over surrender. For weeks, she wanders the moors, a landscape as harsh and unyielding as the world she's rejected. She's cold, hungry, desperate. But she's free. And that freedom is worth more to her than any gilded cage. Then comes St. John Rivers, a man of God with a proposal that sounds more like a contract than a courtship. He offers Jane stability, purpose, even a kind of respectability as his wife, his partner in missionary work. But there's a catch: she must love him not as a man, but as a duty. She must bury her own desires beneath the weight of his calling. Jane listens, considers, and then says no. Again. Because she's learned something crucial: love isn't sacrifice. It's not duty. It's not something you endure. It's something you choose, freely, fully, or not at all. And then, fate intervenes. Jane learns she's inherited money from a long-lost uncle. £20,000, a fortune. In an instant, she's no longer a penniless governess. She's a woman of means. This isn't just luck, it's power. In Victorian England, a married woman's wealth became her husband's property. But Jane, she's unmarried. That money is hers. And with it, she gains something even more valuable than cash: leverage. She can return to Rochester not as a dependent, not as a supplicant, but as an equal. When she does, Thornfield is gone. Burned to the ground in a fire Bertha set in one final, desperate bid for freedom. Rochester is broken, blinded, scarred, his pride stripped away. The man who once commanded the world now sits in the ruins of his own making. And yet, when Jane finds him, something has shifted. The power between them is balanced now. She's not a girl anymore, and he's not a god. They're two wounded people, standing in the ashes of their old lives, asking each other, what now? The novel ends with a quiet scene. Jane and Rochester, married at last, sitting together in their new home, Ferndean. They read, they talk, they raise a child. On the surface, it's a happy ending, the kind Victorian readers might have expected. But is it really that simple? Some say Jane sold out, that after all her defiance, she still ended up in the one place society allowed her, a wife. Others argue that this isn't surrender, it's victory. Because Jane didn't just marry Rochester. She remade the terms. She chose him after she had the means to leave, after she knew she didn't need him to survive. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a negotiation. Love, yes, but on her own terms. Now, let's pull back the lens. Jane Eyre didn't exist in a vacuum. Around the same time, Elizabeth Bennet was navigating the marriage market in Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth is sharp, witty, and she plays the game well. She ends up with Darcy, rich and happy, but always within the rules. Jane Eyre. She burns the rulebook. When Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch marries Casaubon, she sacrifices her dreams for his. Jane would rather starve. And then there's Catherine Earnshaw from Wuthering Heights, wild, destructive, consumed by a love that ruins her. Jane's love is different. It's conditional. It demands honesty. When Rochester lies, she walks. When St. John offers her a loveless marriage, she refuses. Charlotte Bronte isn't just writing a love story. She's rewriting the rules of what love can be. So what is Jane Eyre really about? It's about a woman who refuses to be less than she is. It's about the cost of freedom, the weight of secrets, and the quiet courage it takes to say no even to your own heart. It's about a fire in an attic and a fire in the soul. And it's about the question that lingers long after the last page: can you ever truly be free inside a system built to contain you? Jane's answer? Watch me. But Jane Eyre isn't just a story, it's a battleground of ideas. From the moment it was published, this novel has sparked fierce debates, inspired rebellions in literature, and forced readers to question what they thought they knew about love, power, and justice. Let's step back to the Victorian era for a moment. When Jane Eyre first appeared in 1847, critics were divided. Some praised its raw emotion, calling it a masterpiece of passion and depth. Others, they dismissed it as over-the-top melodrama, too radical, too intense for polite society. But here's the thing, what those early reviewers saw as excess was actually something revolutionary. Jane wasn't just a heroine, she was a woman who demanded to be seen as an equal, who refused to shrink herself to fit into someone else's idea of how she should live. And that terrified people. Fast forward to the 20th century, when feminist scholars like Elaine Showalter and Sandra Gilbert dug deeper into the novel. They didn't just see a love story, they saw a blueprint for female independence. Jane's famous line, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me," wasn't just defiance. It was a declaration of self-ownership, a radical idea in a world where women were often treated as property. But the story doesn't stop there. Because while Jane was fighting for her freedom in England, there was another woman in the shadows, one whose voice had been silenced entirely. Enter Bertha Mason. Or rather, Antoinette Cosway, the name given to her by Jean Rhys in Wide Sargasso Sea, a novel that flips the script on Jane Eyre. Rhys didn't just rewrite Bertha's story, she exposed the ugly truth behind Thornfield's wealth. Because that grand estate, it was built on the backs of enslaved people in the Caribbean. Bertha wasn't just a madwoman in the attic, she was a victim of colonial violence, torn from her home, her culture, her identity, and locked away by a husband who saw her as nothing more than a burden. Rhys's novel forces us to ask, who gets to tell their story? And what happens when the people in power decide some voices don't matter? Now, let's talk about how Jane Eyre keeps evolving. Every generation seems to find something new in it. Take the films, for example. The 1944 version with Orson Welles and Joan Fontaine leans into the Gothic horror, all shadowy halls and brooding glances. But the 2011 BBC miniseries? It zeroes in on Jane's struggle for independence, making her defiance feel fresh and urgent. Then there are the stage adaptations, some of which have even cast Rochester as non-binary, twisting the power dynamics in ways that challenge our assumptions about gender and control. And let's not forget the internet. On YouTube and TikTok, you'll find endless videos dissecting Jane Eyre through modern lenses. Fans and critics alike label Rochester as toxic, celebrate Jane's self-care moment when she leaves Thornfield, and debate whether Bertha is a symbol of repressed feminism or a victim of systemic abuse. It's like the novel is alive, still growing, still pushing us to think harder. So what's the thread that ties all these interpretations together? 3 words: independence, class, and moral courage. Jane's life can be broken down into 4 defining chapters, each one a battle for her soul. First, there's her childhood at Gateshead, where she's treated like an unwanted ghost, locked in rooms, told she's worthless. It's here that Jane learns the first rule of survival: no one will save you. Then comes Lowood School, a place of cold discipline and cruelty. But instead of breaking, Jane finds her strength. She learns that even in a system designed to crush you, you can resist, quietly, stubbornly, from within. By the time she becomes a governess at Thornfield, Jane isn't just surviving, she's thriving. But here's the catch: she's trapped in a strange in-between world. She's not a servant, but she's not genteel either. She's educated enough to see the hypocrisy of the rich, but poor enough to feel their scorn. And then there's Rochester, a man who's lost everything but his pride. Their love story isn't just romantic, it's a clash of worlds. He's used to power, she's used to fighting for scraps. When she finally walks away from him, it's not just about love, it's about refusing to be owned, even by someone she adores. And then, in the final act, something extraordinary happens. Jane inherits money from a long-lost uncle. Suddenly, she's not just emotionally free, she's financially free. When she returns to Rochester, it's on her terms. No more secrets. No more power games. Just two people, equals at last. It's a radical ending for a Victorian novel, one that says, love is only real when it's chosen, not forced. But let's not forget the elephant in the room, class. Jane's entire life is a tightrope walk between two worlds. She's too refined to be a servant, but too poor to be accepted by the aristocracy. This limbo gives her a unique perspective. She sees the cruelty of the rich and the desperation of the poor, and she refuses to romanticize either. Rochester, for all his charm, is a broken aristocrat drowning in debt. Their marriage isn't just a love story, it's a quiet revolution. Because in Victorian England, class was supposed to be everything. But Jane Eyre dares to ask, what if it isn't? What if what really matters is who you are, not where you come from? Then there's religion, a force that shapes Jane's world in ways both beautiful and suffocating. On one side, there's Helen Burns, the gentle girl at Lowood who embodies a kind, forgiving faith. She's the one who tells Jane to love your enemies, advice that sticks with Jane long after Helen is gone. But on the other side, there's St. John Rivers, a man so rigid in his devotion that he sees love as a duty, not a choice. When he demands Jane marry him and become a missionary, she looks him in the eye and says, I scorn your idea of love. It's a rejection of blind obedience, a refusal to let faith become a cage. Jane's spirituality isn't about rules, it's about listening to her own conscience, even when it goes against the grain. And then there's Bertha. Oh, Bertha. The woman in the attic, the scream in the night, the fire that burns Thornfield to the ground. She's been called a monster, a symbol, a warning. But what if she's none of those things? What if she's just a woman who was erased? Modern critics, especially in disability studies, are starting to see her differently, not as a villain, but as someone whose mind was broken by a world that gave her no choices. Her rage isn't madness, it's the only language left to her. And when Thornfield burns, it's not just a house collapsing, it's the old order crumbling, making way for something new. Even the house itself is a character in this story. Thornfield isn't just a mansion, it's a maze of secrets, with locked doors and hidden rooms. The attic where Bertha is kept. That's not just a prison, it's a metaphor for everything Victorian society wanted to hide. The fires, the screams, the crumbling walls, they're all signs of a system that can't hold itself up anymore. And when it all burns down, that's not an ending. That's a cleansing. Because from the ashes, Jane and Rochester build something real at Ferndean, a home without lies, without power games. Just two people, finally free. Advocating for gender equity and economic independence, the novel's emphasis on self-reliance mirrors the rhetoric of first-wave feminists like Margaret Fuller and Frances Willard. These early activists argued that women have just as much natural moral strength and intelligence as men, and those qualities deserve to be recognized. Modern activists still lean into Jane's defiant attitude when they fight for equal pay, the right to make choices about their own bodies, and protection from abuse at home. The line "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me" has become a battle cry for anyone trying to break free from unfair systems that hold them back. But the book isn't perfect. Critics point out that even though Charlotte Bronte wrote a very strong main character, she mostly avoided talking directly about race and colonialism. The only time those topics come up is through the story of Bertha, Rochester's wife locked in the attic. Rochester's fancy lifestyle is paid for by money made from plantations, a detail the book hints at but never really digs into. Plus, the way the book depicts mental illness relies on old, unfair Victorian stereotypes. It links women's strong emotions to being unstable, which is a harmful idea. These gaps mean scholars are still working to unpack the book's full complexity. They use approaches like intersectional analysis, which looks at how different types of oppression overlap, Disability Studies, which examines how disabled people are treated and represented in society, and Postcolonial Theory, which explores the lasting impacts of colonial rule, to get a deeper understanding of the book's nuances. As we wrap up this look at Jane Eyre, let's reflect on why this story still captivates readers hundreds of years after it was written. At its heart, the novel is a Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age story that follows the main character's emotional and mental growth from childhood trauma to a full sense of her own worth. Most coming-of-age stories end with the main character fitting into the world around them. But Jane Eyre doesn't end that way. Jane doesn't just adapt to the rules of the society she lives in. She pushes those rules to shift, making the case that love, doing the right thing, and being independent don't have to be mutually exclusive. The lasting power of Jane Eyre lies in its ability to speak to every generation at once. For Victorian readers, it offered a radical vision, a woman who gets to choose her own destiny. For modern audiences, it provides a model for examining how personal choice connects to bigger, unfair systems that hold whole groups back. Its spooky, Gothic mood invites us to explore the hidden, messy parts of our own minds, while its quick, clever conversations remind us that wit and intelligence are powerful weapons against injustice. So what can we take away from Jane's journey? First, the importance of listening to your own inner voice, even when everyone around you is yelling louder. Second, the need to make sure any love you receive comes with respect. Affection should never ask you to give up your own self-worth. Third, the recognition that true freedom almost always needs financial stability. Without control over your own money, even the strongest moral beliefs can get pushed aside. Finally, the awareness that every personal story exists inside bigger historical forces, class divides, colonial legacies, or religious doctrines that shape how people live. When you pick up Jane Eyre again, try reading it with fresh eyes. Notice the moments when Jane's story pauses, when she stares out the window at the wind, when she feels the cold of a stone wall behind her. Those quiet moments hold the novel's deepest truths, waiting for you to notice them. Remember that the Red Room, the attic, the open moors, and the sudden fires aren't just background details. They're reflections of Jane's inner mind, mirroring the limits and possibilities that shape every human life. To really understand why Jane Eyre still echoes so strongly across centuries, we have to look at the woman who wrote it, Charlotte Brontë. She was born in 1816 in the remote village of Thornton, Yorkshire. She grew up surrounded by the stark, sweeping moorlands that later seeped into her fiction like a living breath. Charlotte was homeschooled with her siblings Emily, Anne, and their brother Branwell by their father Patrick Bronte, an Irish Anglican clergyman whose sermons emphasized both piety and sharp intellectual rigor. This home classroom was a hotbed of imagination. The kids invented entire elaborate worlds, complete with miniature forts and made-up languages, which later showed up as the deep, emotional interiority of their novels. Charlotte's early education included a short stint at the clergy daughters' school at Cowan Bridge, a place she would later turn into the Lowood institution in her writing. The school ran a harsh regime, with not enough food, poor heating, and a punitive disciplinary system. This experience left an indelible scar on her p. There's something haunting about the Red Room in Jane Eyre, that locked chamber where young Jane is imprisoned as punishment. The walls seem to close in, the air thick with dread. And it's no accident that this space mirrors the suffocating halls of Cowan Bridge, the real-life school where Charlotte Brontë and her sisters endured hardship. But Charlotte didn't just write about her pain, she turned it into something sharper. Jane Eyre isn't just a story, it's a quiet rebellion. A way to expose how Victorian charity, meant to lift people up, often just trapped them in new kinds of cages. Imagine leaving everything you know, your country, your language, your comforts, and stepping into a world that dazzles and terrifies in equal measure. That's what Charlotte did in 1842 when she travelled to Brussels. At the Pensionnat Heger, a boarding school for young women, She was surrounded by French Romanticism, by ideas about freedom and feminism that crackled in the air like electricity. She fell in love with Constantine Heger, a man who would ultimately choose another woman. The heartbreak sent her reeling back to England, where she faced a harsh truth: the literary world had no place for women. Not really. So she did what many women of her time couldn't: she disguised herself. Under the name Cura Belle, a man's name, she published Jane Eyre in 1847. The book would follow the rules of the popular sensation novels of the day: 3 volumes, drama, mystery, but it would also break them, quietly and deliberately. Thornfield Hall isn't just a setting in Jane Eyre, it's a character. Picture it: a grand, looming manor with twisting hallways, shadowy corners, and a firelit drawing room where secrets whisper through the walls. On the surface, Thornfield is wealth and power, the domain of Edward Rochester, a man born into privilege. But beneath the polished floors and elegant furnishings, there's another world. Servants move unseen. Hidden passages wind like veins through the house. And above it all, locked away in the attic, is Bertha Mason, Rochester's wife, the madwoman no one is supposed to see or hear. Bertha isn't just a plot twist. She's a mirror held up to Victorian society. She comes from Jamaica, a British colony where the scars of slavery were still fresh, where the 1833 Emancipation Act had just begun to shake the foundations of empire. By locking Bertha away, Charlotte isn't just telling a ghost story, she's showing how the civilized world dealt with what it feared. The people it deemed too different, too wild, too other. Bertha's imprisonment is the empire's dirty secret, hidden behind closed doors. But Bertha is more than a symbol of colonial fear. She's also a tragic figure in the story of women's mental health in the 1800s. Back then, a woman with strong emotions, or worse, strong opinions, could be labeled hysterical. Doctors would prescribe rest cures, isolation, even institutionalization. Bertha's rage, her outbursts, her eventual death, they're a warning. This is what happens when a woman is stripped of her voice, her agency, her very humanity. Jane, on the other hand, fights back. Not with violence, but with words, with moral courage, with the quiet insistence that she deserves to be treated as an equal. Scholars like Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar have argued that Bertha is the shadow of Jane's own suppressed anger, the fury that Victorian women were never allowed to express. Then there's Rochester himself, a man of contradictions. He's the classic Byronic hero, brooding, haunted, capable of deep love but also deep cruelty. His past is a tangle of mistakes and secrets, including his disastrous marriage to Bertha, a Creole woman whose existence he erases from polite society. Rochester's decision to hide Bertha isn't just personal, it's a product of his time. In Victorian England, respectability was everything, and the price of keeping up appearances was often deception. But Rochester's story doesn't end in shame. By the novel's close, he's maimed, humbled, and finally ready to meet Jane not as a master to a servant, but as an equal. His redemption is painful, but it's real, a testament to the idea that true change often comes through suffering. Jane's job as a governess puts her in an awkward in-between space. She's not a servant, but she's not quite a lady either. She's educated, refined, but she still has to work for her living, a reality that chafes against the rigid class rules of Victorian England. Governesses like Jane were caught in a trap, expected to act like ladies but treated like hired help. Charlotte knew this struggle firsthand. She and her sisters had all worked as governesses, facing the exhaustion, the loneliness, the constant reminder that they were neither fully accepted nor fully free. When Jane walks away from Thornfield, she's not just leaving a job, she's rejecting the idea that she has to sacrifice her dignity for security. It's a radical act, one that would have shocked many readers at the time. There's a moment in the book where Jane declares, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me." It's a line that echoes the ideas of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American philosopher who wrote about self-reliance just a few years earlier. Emerson argued that true freedom comes from within, that no one can define you unless you let them. Jane lives by this creed. She refuses to be caged, whether by poverty, by love, or by society's expectations. But Charlotte doesn't let Jane's independence become selfishness. Jane's strength is tempered by something deeper, a moral compass, a Christian sense of duty. She doesn't just fight for herself, she fights for what's right, even when it costs her. Jane Eyre's faith is not a rigid set of rules but a living, breathing compass shaped by the warmth of Christian teachings. She draws on the gentle guidance of Psalm 23, where the Lord is a shepherd, and the selfless kindness of the Good Samaritan. Her morality blends deep personal conviction with a faith that values humility, forgiveness, and care for others. This balance challenges the idea that a person must choose between independence and religious devotion. Instead, Jane shows that the two can coexist, each strengthening the other. The Gothic elements in Jane Eyre are not just there for atmosphere. They are the heartbeat of the story, amplifying the emotional and psychological struggles beneath the surface. Picture the storm that rages as Jane first meets Rochester on the moors. It is not just bad weather. It mirrors the turmoil inside Jane, the unrest that society tries to keep hidden. Then there is fire, appearing again and again like a thread stitching the story together. The hearth in the Red Room, the blaze that destroys Thornfield, the candlelight in Jane's quiet moments, fire brings both ruin and rebirth. It burns away the old, oppressive world of Thornfield, making space for a new relationship built on respect. On the other hand, the cold, stone walls of the attic where Bertha is locked away feel like a prison. They highlight the novel's sharp critique of how men controlled and confined women. To truly understand Jane Eyre, we need to step into the world of the 1840s, a time of huge social change in Britain. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had created workhouses meant to discourage people from seeking help, turning poverty into something shameful. Charlotte Brontë paints Mr. Brocklehurst, the hypocritical headmaster, as a man who preaches about self-denial while living in luxury. This reflects the real tension of the time between charity in words and exploitation in actions. There are also quiet nods to the Chartist movement, a push by the working class for a voice in politics. When Jane refuses Rochester's proposal after learning he is already married, she is rejecting more than just a man. She is saying no to a system that would trap her in an unfair and morally wrong situation. Beneath the surface of the story, there are also echoes of colonialism. Rochester's wife, Bertha, comes from Jamaica. Her mother is described as a beautiful Creole woman, yet her background is treated as exotic and foreign. This erasure shows how Victorian society often ignored or simplified the identities of people from the colonies. By tying Bertha's madness to her Caribbean roots, Charlotte Brontë seems to question the effects of empire, not just on those who were colonized but also on the colonizers themselves. The novel becomes a place where personal pain meets bigger questions about power and control. Charlotte Bronté's use of first-person narration was groundbreaking. It lets us step directly into Jane's mind, feeling her doubts, her fears, and her moments of courage. Jane's voice is a fascinating mix of humility and strength. She insists on her own worth but never claims to be better than others. This quiet defiance challenges the idea that women should be passive and obedient. By telling her own story, Jane invites us to see the world through her eyes and to question the rules that society imposes. The ending of Jane Eyre is complex and thought-provoking. Jane returns to Rochester, but he is no longer the powerful man he once was. A fire has left him physically changed, and Jane now has her own money from an inheritance. Their reunion is built on equality. Rochester no longer towers over her, and Jane is not dependent on him. This balance suggests that true love and partnership can only happen when both people see and respect each other's strengths and weaknesses. Feminist critics have debated this ending for years. Some see it as a step backward, reinforcing old power structures. Others argue that it redefines marriage, showing a relationship based on mutual respect rather than control. When Jane Eyre was first published, it was marketed as an autobiography. This was a clever move, making the story seem like a personal confession rather than fiction, which helped it avoid some of the prejudice against women writers at the time. Critics were divided. Some praised its moral strength, while others were shocked by Jane's boldness in challenging male authority. Over time, the novel's reputation has swung between being dismissed as overly dramatic and celebrated as a key work of feminist literature. In the 1970s, as women began to demand more space in classrooms and in culture, Jane Eyre found a new home in university books. It wasn't just a love story anymore. Professors started asking, what does Jane's silence say about power? Why is Bertha locked away? Who gets to tell the truth in a world that rewards obedience? The novel became a mirror not just for readers, but for a generation asking who gets to be heard. Movies kept changing how we saw it. In 1943, with Orson Welles as Rochester and Joan Fontaine as Jane, the dark halls of Thornfield felt like a haunted house. The wind howled. Candles flickered. It was Gothic terror wrapped in silk. But by 2011, with Mia Wasikowska and Michael Fassbender, the same rooms felt different. The fire was still there, but now it burned with longing, with quiet rebellion. This Jane didn't scream. She stood still. And that was louder. On stage, some directors turned the story upside down. They let Bertha speak. Not as a monster, but as a woman crushed under the weight of empire and madness. They showed how colonial greed locked her away not just in an attic, but in history. The audience didn't just watch Jane fight for dignity. They watched Bertha fight to be remembered. Even comic books picked up the story. Black and white panels showed Jane's hands trembling as she wrote her letters. The wind on the moors wasn't just wind, it was the sound of freedom slipping through her fingers. The chestnut tree split by lightning? It wasn't just a tree. It was her heart, broken open, still growing. Jane Eyre isn't one story. It's many layers, like an old parchment where someone wrote, then scraped it clean, then wrote again. Each time you read it, you see something new. Think about your own Thornfield. Maybe it's your job where you're told to smile even when you're tired. Maybe it's your family where silence is called peace. Maybe it's your own mind, whispering, "This isn't right," while the world shouts, "Just go along." Jane heard that whisper. And she listened. Now imagine a modern Jane. A freelance teacher, working from her kitchen table. Her schedule is set by an app. Her pay changes with the market. Her boss. A screen. Her red room. The algorithm that decides she's not a good fit. Her attic. The data no one sees, the clips of her speaking too softly, her pauses too long, her voice too plain. They don't lock her up. They just don't show her. The same questions still live. How do you stay true when the world wants you small? How do you speak when your voice is drowned out by noise? Go back to a quiet moment in the book. The taste of sea air after Jane leaves Thornfield. The way the wind smells like salt and freedom. The chestnut tree, split down the middle, still standing. That's not just description. That's resilience. You felt that. Maybe after a long day. Maybe after a silence that lasted too long. Maybe when you finally said no and the world didn't end. That's Jane. Not a character in a book. A mirror. The story doesn't end with the last page. It ends when you look inside yourself and ask, what's my attic? What's my voice? And what am I willing to walk away from to keep it? Charlotte Bronte wrote this in a time when women were told to be quiet. She wrote anyway. And now, over a century later, we're still listening.